Hey students, welcome back. And today we are going to get into chapter 7 of the text. And we're going to be focusing on California's economic and cultural growth. So let's begin. Here are the key terms for this chapter. You'll see the beginning key terms are focusing on water and water issues in the state. This is something that we are actually going to be returning to later on when we talk about the building of the major water systems like the Los Angeles Aqueduct and the California Aqueduct. But we're going to begin by introducing some of the conflicts around water and water rights in the state. Then we're going to talk about the Salton Sea, Tulare Lake. Both of those key terms are actually not in your textbook, so you're going to want to pay extra close attention to that part of the lecture. And then we're going to move on to talk about the various industries that emerge in California, bringing profitability to the state, also bringing a lot of people to the state to work in these industries. And then we're going to talk about the war, the Spanish-American War, and the Filipino-American War, the results of those wars, and then finally end with education in California. So beginning with water rights. So water in this state is a really precious commodity. Certain parts of the state are very arid and dry. We also have seasonal water in parts of the state. A lot of the state's water relies upon rainfall and snowmelt. And so water is a major issue. And as more people come to California, it becomes a bigger and bigger issue as time goes on. So in the East, right, the Americans that were coming into California when California became a state were used to a particular type of water right called riparian rights. Riparian rights are basically the idea that if you own a piece of land that is next to a body of water, then you should have access to that water. By the same measure, you can't block that water up so that people downstream from you cannot have access to that water. So basically, the water becomes owned by the people who own the land next to the waterway, whether that waterway be a lake, a river, a stream, etc. Now, under Spanish law, however, the way that water rights worked in California was that you would just basically claim a right to a waterway, and you might, for example, divert that water for your own personal needs. And that worked okay when you had a smaller population in the state, but as the population grew, that became a problem. So there's this conflict between the Americans who are used to the riparian water rights system and then the old guard of California that was used to the appropriation style of water rights. And this causes conflict. It does cause a series of lawsuits as well. And eventually, the California legislature is going to pass the Right Irrigation Act, and this will be in 1887. And basically, what this says is that it allows for farmers in particular to form water districts for agriculture, regardless of whether or not they have direct water access. So, if you were somebody who could get access to water via a well or something like that, and then you could distribute that water, creating a water district, then you could basically own those water rights. And this leads to huge amounts of irrigated land throughout the Central Valley, the San Joaquin Valley primarily, also down in the Imperial Valley down here near the Coachella Valley, the Imperial Valley. So those become irrigation districts. And so this is a different model than what we see in other parts of the country. But it's really important because it allows for California then to have these agricultural irrigation districts which have diverted natural waterways in order to irrigate land for agriculture. So another major issue in the state is the issue of floods. Floods would happen for a number of reasons. One was, of course, like I said, we have these seasonal wet times of year where there's rain, or sometimes you get snow melt. Sometimes you have very heavy rains, and that could cause, problems. And the infrastructure really wasn't built to deal with floods in the 19th century. And here you have an image of San Bernardino in the Great Flood of 1862. And this was the type of thing that would happen on a regular basis, both in Northern California and in Southern California. In Northern California, a lot of the floods were due to the hydro, hydraulic mining that happened towards the latter part of the mining industry in the Sierra Nevada. So you had these hydraulic mining companies who would go out into the Sierra. They would blast the sides of mountains to try to reveal the gold, and then that silt would come down the mountainside and fill up the waterways, and that caused a lot of problems and a lot of flooding as the waterways were being blocked. So what happens is, in order to manage these waterways, levees are going to be built. And this is true for the Central Valley, also known as the San Joaquin Valley, same thing, um, where farmers would build these levees to try to protect their farmland from flooding. And also in Southern California, where you would have, again, sort of these seasonal floods that would take place, and these big riverways that we have that go through the Inland Empire and also Los Angeles, right? Of course, the Los Angeles River, the Santa Ana River, these are all rivers that would flood on a regular basis. And so they needed to be controlled. They needed to have levees built so that to protect the surrounding towns and populations. So the farmers in the Central Valley started to get really upset by the fact that their farms would flood on a regular basis, and a lot of it had to do with the hydraulic mining. And so they decided to sue, and they won their lawsuit in 1884. This is Woodruff versus the North Bloomfield Gravel Mining Company. And this was a hydraulic mining company, and this mining company was polluting the waterways, filling up the waterways with silt, and then thereby creating these floods. And it was a landmark case because the farmers are going to win this case. And this is kind of going to be the beginning of the end for hydraulic mining in the state of California, because this will severely limit hydraulic mining companies' ability to mine near major waterways. And so this will set an environmental precedent for the moving forward after 1884. So this is the first major environmental victory really in the state. And the state had suffered quite significantly environmental damage as a result of mining, but also as the result of just resource exploitation generally, because of overfishing, of timber companies, those types of things. So this is the beginning of sort of a conservation or a focus on environmental issues within the state. So Woodruff versus North Bloomfield Gravel Mining Company. I don't think that this particular lawsuit is in your textbook either. So you want to make sure that you know about this lawsuit. And the main thing that you need to know is that it's important because it is the first major piece of environmental legislation in the state to protect the lands, even though this particular case was meant to protect the farmers and their private property. It still is important in stopping hydraulic mining in the state and the damage that it causes. So this is an example of the destruction that's caused by hydraulic mining. You can really see that the whole hillsides being blasted away and exposed in this image. Okay, so now we are going to turn our attention to a man by the name of George Chaffee, and he will have a major impact on the development of Southern California, particularly when it comes to water systems and also electric systems. He was a self-taught engineer and entrepreneurial genius from Canada, and as I mentioned, he comes to California and he sees this opportunity to create these water systems in the Inland Empire. And he begins with Etwanda and then later on moves on to Ontario and Upland, where he creates these water systems and then through these water systems is able to create hydroelectricity. And this is a time when people were not, the Inland Empire had no access to electricity until these hydroelectric plants were established. It was considered the most innovative agricultural settlement west of the Rockies. And George Chaffee will later on go on to Australia, where he will be an inspiration for several of the colonies in Australia. So he establishes in 1884 the LA Electric Company, and this succeeded in making Los Angeles the first electrically lit city in the United States. And again, this will draw international attention. The other thing that he is known for and significant for us here locally is that he puts the money, funds the building of the Alamo Canal, which is the first irrigation canal in the Imperial Valley. And this will be built in 1901. And this will divert water from the Colorado River to irrigate the Imperial Valley. So this is the beginning of farming and agriculture in the Imperial Valley, and this will also, of course, bring settlement to the valley as well. Within 8 months of the Alamo Canal being built, 2,000 settlers will move into the newly irrigated region. And this leads us to our next key term, which is not in your textbook, but I like to teach about it because, of course, it is here locally. So the Salton Sea. The Salton Sea is a man-made sea. Now, it did used to contain a lake, a natural lake, Lake Cahuilla. And Lake Cahuilla was created as a result of the Colorado River diverting its water into the basin. And the Colorado River has changed directions multiple times throughout its history. But what creates the Salton Sea in the early 20th century is a canal that ruptures. So you have these irrigation canals that are being built in the Imperial Valley in order to divert water from the Colorado River to the farms in the Imperial Valley. And there was an especially wet year in 1905, and that wet year brought with it a bunch of silt and things down the riverway, and it ends up filling up the canals as well. And a canal will rupture and begin to spill water into the Salton Sea basin. And that water will continue to flow into the basin for 2 years, thereby creating the Salton Sea. And the Salton Sea will become it does destroy some railways that had gone through there. There was some buildings as well that were built on the Salton Sea basin that will also be destroyed or submerged by the canal rupture. But basically, people become accustomed to the fact that now there's this big sea in the Salton Sea basin, and in the 1950s and 60s, it becomes this recreational area, people coming out there to water ski and boat and vacation. And then by the 1970s, it will fall into disrepair. And so we have now what was once this recreational area now has fallen into disrepair. Part of the issue with the Salton Sea is that it is shrinking, it's evaporating. And you have the fact that on occasion there are these big algae blooms that take place in the sea that make it so that there's not enough oxygen in the water, and so the fish begin to die off, and these big fish die off then cause this massive stench, this odor to come from the sea. The sea itself is not polluted. That's one of the things that's really misunderstood about the Salton Sea, is that water quality itself is not bad. It's just simply that it's evaporating, that there are these algae blooms, and that it just has no way of sustaining itself because it doesn't have any reliable, renewable source of water. One of the ways that it has stayed for as long as it has, is that the irrigation runoff from the surrounding farms has sustained it, and also the whitewater wash, which is a wash that carries water when it does rain in the desert down into the Salton Sea. So if you click on this link right here, it will take you to a Desert Sun article. This is from 2018, so it's relatively recent, and it's a neat article because it's interactive and it has a lot of information about the history of the Salton Sea and some of the current issues facing the sea. The main one being that it's evaporating, it's drying up, and it's exposing these, salt flats, basically, where it could cause these massive dust storms when the wind picks up. So there's an image of the Salton Sea right there, and you can see here this is the sort of exposed underlying lake bed, and those are the areas that are of concern as the lake begins to dry up and the wind starts to blow. It can cause this dust, to blow. So if you click on this link here, and I highly recommend that you do, there will be about I think it's about 15 minutes. It might be a little less. 10 minute. I think it's 10 minute. 10-minute video on the history of the Salton Sea. So it talks about how the Salton Sea changed over time, how Lake Cahuilla once existed and then Lake Cahuilla dried up, etc. So it shows sort of the geologic history of this region. So I recommend clicking on that. Okay, the other thing I wanted to talk about in terms of water when it comes to California is the Central Valley. And if you'll notice, so this is the Central Valley, also known as the San Joaquin Valley. Okay, so the same thing. You can see why it's called the Central Valley because of where it's located in the state. It's centrally located. And it's a huge valley. Look how long this valley is. And it's extremely fertile. It's filled with riverways and marshlands and things. Rivers, this is the Sierra Nevada mountain range, right? This is the coastal mountain range. And the Central Valley, the San Joaquin Valley, gets the runoff from all of these areas, including the snow melt from the Sierra Nevada. And this, when the Spanish came to California, they noted how fertile this valley was, how the soil was very rich, how there was lots of water in this valley, and there was lots of animals, tons of birds, tons of elk, just wildlife of all different sorts. But as we get into the American period, you start to see this region of the state transform dramatically. And it's transforming because of its agricultural opportunities. Here in the Central Valley is, like I said, the very fertile soil, and the access to water then allows for this valley to be transformed over time. And it's very dramatically transformed. And I'm going to show you how it is transformed now. So the first major transformation that takes place in the Central Valley is the disappearance of Tulare Lake. So here we have a map that shows the location of Tulare Lake. This was a huge, huge lake that existed in the Central Valley and over the span of 50 years basically dried up. It was at one time one of the largest freshwater lakes west of the Mississippi. And because of these irrigation districts and the transformation of the landscape in the Central Valley, it will dry up by the year 1900. This was a huge lake. The Spanish noted it on all of their maps. Um, if you're familiar with this region, so basically, if you go over the grapevine, okay, as you're going over the grapevine headed north, okay, on Interstate 5, if you would have gone down the mountain and looked down into the Central Valley, you would have seen this massive Tulare Lake. The Spanish, in order to get across it, actually ran ferries across it. But it, like I said, it was quite remarkable, and it covered this huge span, which would basically be in the middle of what is now Interstate 5 and Highway 99, with Bakersfield being somewhere around here. So, so it goes to show what an impact human beings could have on the landscape, that this massive body of water will be dried up simply because humans are diverting the water in order to create these irrigation districts. And now today, if you were to take an aerial view of the Central Valley or even fly over the Central Valley, you will notice that it is just this patchwork quilt of farms and irrigated landscapes. You'll also notice these canals that run through the Central Valley. These are irrigation canals, so these are meant to control the water, bring the water to the farming districts throughout the Central Valley. And again, the California, of course, the largest commodity coming out of California still to this day is our agricultural products. So a massive transformed landscape. Okay, so California in the latter half of the 19th century is going to be experiencing massive economic growth. One of the signs of this is that a stock exchange opens in San Francisco in 1862. This is just 12 years after California becomes part of the United States. You've got all of these different industries out here: mining, agriculture, logging, fishing, right? Lots of merchants making money as a result of the gold rush, right? And we talked about the big four. The big four made their fortunes through being merchants in Sacramento before they invested in the Central Pacific. So California really becomes this place of economic opportunity. People are moving here from other parts of the country, people moving here from other parts of the world in order to engage in this economic abundance. So one of the huge things that takes off after the gold rush era has kind of calmed down is the wheat, the California grown wheat. And in the 1870s, wheat will surpass gold as California's most valuable product. Now, California wheat is a special variety of wheat that is extremely hardy, and it would dry very well and it would ship very well. So this becomes something that people want not just in Europe, but also in Asia, where wheat is being introduced as this staple crop. So you're starting to get California wheat being sent out to places in Europe, places in Asia, all over the world. People are consuming California wheat, and the wheat farmers are becoming very, very wealthy. They come to be known as the wheat barons. Um, Now, grower John Bidwell won a gold medal at the 1878 Paris International Expo, meaning that his wheat and his grain was judged to be the finest in the world. So in 1878, you've got California wheat being graded as the finest in the world. So it was highly desirable. Now, in 1889, California had 3 million acres of wheat fields. It was the nation's second larger producer of the staple crop. And unfortunately, it also is very hard on the soil. And so it ended up depleting a lot of the soil. And ultimately, wheat is going to face competition internationally. And so, although wheat does take its toll on the environment in California in terms of, um, you know, uh, creating irrigation districts and also depleting the soil, ultimately, it will actually be citrus that will overcome the wheat industry as being California's main sort of iconic crop. So let's turn now to talking about the citrus industry. So the Spanish missionaries are the ones who introduced citrus orchards in California. And citrus turns out to be very effective in fighting off scurvy, which is a disease that a lot of sailors would often get. It's essentially where you don't have enough the vitamin C in the citrus actually fought off the scurvy. And so it becomes one of those staple foods that you want to have on ships. And keep in mind that ships are the primary way in which things get moved about the world at this time, right? No planes at this time. So, I mean, everything is shipped via ships. So California becomes known for its oranges, lemons, grapefruits, tangerines, limes, and it becomes the main focus of this citrus growing is in Southern California in the Los Angeles basin. In 1893, as you can see from the slide, 70 million California oranges were sold nationwide. So it becomes huge, but it also becomes part of this larger Pacific trade, right? So not only are the citrus being sent back to the East Coast Midwestern states, but they are also being sent to Asia, parts of Asia, Australia, Europe, all over the world. California citrus comes to be known. Another major business in California, agricultural business, is the wine business. So, wine growing, again, introduced by the Spanish, the missionaries, where they grew wine at the missions. But it will really take off in the American period, beginning in Southern California and then spreading to Northern California with the introduction of some European varieties of wine. This becomes wine will eventually um, become a very popular item out of California, although California wines don't really gain international recognition, I should say, until the 1970s. So it'll be quite some time before it'll gain international recognition. But again, the wine growing becomes very popular in California, especially for domestic consumption. Mining continues to be profitable throughout the late 19th century. This is an old stamping mill for hard rock mining. Just as a reminder, the hard rock mining, of course, is when you extract the rocks out of the mines that you've dug into the earth to get these massive rocks, and then you take them to the stamping mill, and these stampers, these big hammers, basically break them apart, and then at that point you introduce mercury, which will uh, separate the precious metal from the rock. Okay, one of the most famous items to come out of the gold rush era in California are Levi's jeans. Levi Strauss was somebody who came to California again as opportunity, looking to make money off of gold rush, off of the miners, and he realizes that he could make these very durable jeans that didn't require washing on a regular basis, right? The whole idea behind jeans is not only are they durable, but that they could endure a lot of dirt and grime without requiring washing. And so Levi opens up his jean company in San Francisco, and this is an old advertisement for Levi jeans. You can see copper riveted, right? Patented in 1873. And this is an ad showing a couple of horses trying to tear the jeans apart. And look at that, they can't even do that. So it's supposed to really advertise a hardy jean that can be worn out in the gold fields. Okay, fishing also huge in California. Of course, we've got these hundreds of miles of coastline here in the state, and it there was thousands of fish. I mean, the fish were extremely abundant in the early days of California, and by 1880s, with the refrigerator rail cars, you could then export the fish to other parts of the country and inland. And so this was a very, very popular industry. Unfortunately, the fish population is going to be heavily depleted by the time we get into the early 20th century. A lot of the big California fisheries are going to suffer because of lack of fish, because of overfishing. Okay, and then you also have the timber industry. And last week you did a response on the California redwoods, right? And the conservation efforts of the California redwoods. And here you see some images of these massive trees being cut. And it really gives you a sense of the scale of how big these trees were. When the Spanish came, of course, they noted that these trees were massive and huge, and but you know, the Spanish, there wasn't enough settlers really to make a huge impact on the population of the old growth trees. But when the American settlers come, they start to cut these trees like crazy. And just one single tree, right, could make, you know, maybe two or three houses. And so this was huge, and people just start cutting these big old growth redwoods, and that will spur the conservation movement. You can look here at again, this is a huge tree of calaveras. They're having a full-on dance party on top of the stump of this tree. So again, these it just gives you a sense of the scale of these trees. But the logging industry remained very strong in California, still is alive and well in certain parts of California, Northern California in particular. But back then, it was really sort of a free for all. And that's the reason why the conservationists really had to stop, put an end to this sort of just reckless killing of these old growth forests. Okay, so California redwood becomes world renowned for its unique qualities. The first being that it's kind of a natural fire retardant. It repels fire. It's difficult to completely burn redwood. And then also it's a natural insecticide. It repels insects. So it becomes kind of this ideal construction material, particularly for outdoor structures. That's the reason why people like to build decks made out of redwood. But it just it as you can see from this ad, I mean, it clearly says California redwood products, and again, just really pushing this idea of California redwood and its unique qualities. So all of these different types of products were being made from California redwood and shipped to other parts of the country, and of course around the world as well. Okay, so now we're going to turn our attention to talking about two other big industries in the state that emerge in the late 19th century. The first being oil. The oil industry in California is really going to take off in the 1890s. And this is, um, not just oil extraction, but also oil refining. And the oil that was being used at this time was primarily kerosene, and this was used for lighting and heat. And in 1890, the Union Oil Company will be founded in Southern California. Probably the person that is most closely associated with oil in California is Edward Doheny. He will be the first to develop Los Angeles's first oil field, and he does this in 1892. The location was near the La Brea tar pits, and basically he becomes after that the major supplier of fuel oil for the Southern California Railway, which was a subsidiary of the Santa Fe Railroad. So the from during this time period, the railroads were switching from coal fuel to oil fuel. So this was then opening up this huge market for oil. And of course, these early oil entrepreneurs in California became very, very rich as a result of this. Standard Oil was also operating in California as well, and there were also oil fields in Northern California. So there were oil fields all throughout the state. Southern California was the first, but then you also have some oil fields in the Central Valley and also in Northern California as well. The other big mineral or coming out of the state is borax, and borax is used for cleaning products, primarily used mainly in laundry detergents, but also other products as well. And Francis Marion Smith is going to be the person most closely associated with borax. There were several people prior to him, but he will found the Pacific Coast Borax Company, also founded in 1890. And this particular company is going to become, again, international companies shipping borax, not just throughout the United States, but also throughout the world. And that's true also with the oil from Southern California as well. So both of these industries become massive international industries. So it does even take off even further after the opening of the Panama Canal in 1914. When the Panama Canal opens up, of course, linking the Pacific and the Atlantic Oceans, this then allows for shipments to much more efficiently go from one side of the country to the other, but also from the Pacific coast over to Europe and other markets in Europe, Africa, the Mediterranean, etc. So here we have an image of the Los Angeles oil fields. These oil fields spread all the way from, where modern day La Brea all the way down to the coastline, where there were oil drills all up and down the coast. So here you have two images. The one on the left is a modern image of the borax mines still in operation up in the Mojave Desert. And then the one you see on the right is the 20 Mule team, which was famous for carrying the borax from the mines to the railroad depots and putting them on the railroad, putting the borax on the railroads, and then the railroads taking the borax to the shipyards where then it would be shipped out to other parts of the country or the world. So, this idea of a greater California, what does it mean to be part of this greater California? It really is about this extensive maritime activity that came in and out of the state. You also have, as a result of this maritime activity that stretched all the way from Alaska to Siberia, Baja, China, Latin America, through the Panama Canal over to Europe. This is also not just connecting California with the rest of the world through commerce, but it's also connecting us through immigration as people begin to come to California from all these different corners of the world, bringing with them their cultural influences. Also, people were coming to California to visit and to recreate, and this was being promoted by California boosters, as they were known, and they would create these posters of California, and the railroad companies would give these specials so that people could come to California at a discount and escape the horrible, East Coast winters and come to California and bask in the sun. California becomes known as a health destination, as a place where you could go to get healthy. California deserts come to be known as a place where you could recover from different types of tuberculosis and lung conditions. And so, and also you get as a result of all of this tourism and boosterism, you also get this idea of California as being unique. California has a unique history. It's not like other parts of the United States. It has this Spanish past, it has this Mexican past, and you get this Spanish revival movement that was really sort of playing off this uniqueness of California's history and trying to get people to come to the state to experience that unique history. One of the people who is most closely related to or associated with this Spanish revival movement is a man by the name of Charles Fletcher Loomis. He will be very influential. He was a Los Angeles Times reporter. He was a poet, an Indian advocate, an amateur art anthropologist, and he would oftentimes dress in this very flamboyant Southwestern garb. And he would, often write about California's, mission past and how California is unique. And so, I mean, he's an interesting figure in that he um, came to California as a young man after he had dropped out of his Harvard in his senior year. He walked to California from Ohio, and it took him, it was 3,500 miles, and he arrived in California in 1885. He now he's basically known as being the original booster, the original idea of this Spanish revival. But this idea of Greater California is important to understand the uniqueness of California and California's history, and also California's identity as a state. So here we have an example of this Spanish revival that was happening in the early 20th century. The Mission Inn in Riverside, California, originally built by a man by the name of C.C. Miller, who came to California in the 1870s, originally as a civil engineer. He was here to work on various water projects, again, going back to this water management thing that is a constant, ongoing thing in California. So he came to Riverside in 1874, but then later on um, built a boarding house, which will later on become the Mission Inn. And the Mission Inn, the first wing of the Mission Inn that was built as it stands today, was built in 1903. And again, there was never a mission in Riverside, but this Mission Inn, this hotel, was made to look like a mission. And again, very much along this idea of Spanish revival, very much playing on the unique history of California. And indeed, the Mission Inn still to this day brings lots of tourists and visitors from all over the world that want to experience this sort of authentic, quote unquote, old California. Okay, so now we're going to turn our attention to talking about California and its role in the imperialistic wars that took place at the turn of the 20th century. Your textbook calls it California in the Spanish American Cuban Filipino War. I should say that there's actually only two wars that take place, the Spanish American War and the Filipino American War. Cuba was involved, and especially in the beginning of the Spanish American War, but we're really just talking about two wars here. California's role in these wars that begin in 1898 and then eventually end in 1902 is significant because California will be the launching off point for both the naval fleets, but also for troops. And California will be the place where a lot of the troops will get trained, particularly the Presidio in San Francisco. And so this is important. Now, both of these wars are important generally to United States history because of acquisition of territories. So the United States, after the end of the Spanish-American War, will acquire Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines, and those all will become U.S. territories. And it will also gain significant influence as a result of the Spanish-American War over Cuban politics and economics. The Filipino-American War will happen as a result, really, of the Spanish-American War because the Filipino independence fighters really wanted to have independence after the Spanish-American War, and the Americans were unwilling to give them that. And so they basically turned the Philippines into a U.S. territory. And in retaliation for that, Filipino independence fighters rise up against the Americans. And that will ensue in a 3-year long war, which will last from 1899 to 1902, with some fighting that continues after that. But the official end to the war is 1902. The end result is that the United States is going to suppress the Philippines, and the Philippines will remain a U.S. territory until 1946. So here are the three main results of the turn of the century wars for California. The number one is the development of harbors and naval shipyards here in the state. It becomes, again, this major launching off point for military naval activity throughout the Pacific. Number two, you have a communication line that will be laid between California and Hawaii, the Midway Islands, Guam, and the Philippines, basically connecting California all the way across the Pacific, all the way to Asia. And then number three, because the Philippines will become a U.S. territory, Filipino immigrants will begin arriving in the United States, particularly in California, particularly in coastal cities, but also working inland in agriculture, particularly like in the Central Valley and the Imperial Valleys. The image that you see right here are troops boarding the USS Indiana on their way to Manila in the Philippines. So again, this is all happening in California as a launching off point. And California turns out to be militarily very strategic for the United States. Okay, so California's history in terms of education is an interesting one as well. There was little to no education in educational institutions in California when California became a state. I think there were three schools in California at the time. And when we talked about the Spanish and Mexican period of California, we talked about how illiteracy rates were very high. You know, not a lot of um, um, literate Californians at that time, but there was really no reason for people to be literate back then. But as California becomes part of the United States, educational institutions will get established here. And part of the issue right off the bat was getting teachers, qualified teachers in the state so that, you know, you could have an educated population that is qualified to teach. And so in 1857, California will open up its first normal schools, later on known as Cal States. And these are schools which are established to train teachers. The first one was in San Jose, and then later on, the Cal State system will expand throughout the state. In 1869, the first University of California will open up. The University of California initially had been a school that was meant for agricultural, mining, and mechanical arts, but it was renamed and chartered in 1868 and then opened in 1869 as the University of California. And the first one was in Berkeley, and the new institution was named after George Berkeley, an Irish philosopher and bishop. So women were admitted into UC Berkeley immediately, and there was no quotas. So as many women as were eligible and could apply, could get into the institution. So that made that unique as well. The same was also true for the normal schools. In 1874, the California legislature will adopt compulsory education for elementary school. So basically, if you're a child, you need to go to elementary school. So everybody in the state, moving forward after 1874, all the children in the state would be required to attend elementary school. 1878, you have the first law school established in San Francisco. Two notable students who graduated from Hastings Law School early on was Clara Shortridge Foltz and Laura DeForce Gordon. And both of these are two really remarkable California women. They both got law degrees. Um, uh, and I'm going to talk more about each of them in a minute, but they really did have to fight in order to get recognized as lawyers. Lawyers were or studying law was considered one of those things that was a male dominated industry. So this was very unique. But again, they had to sue in order to get into the Hastings Law School. But once they did, they opened up the door for other women to be able to get their law degrees. And then as we get into the 1870s, 80s, and 90s, you are going to see the establishment of multiple private colleges throughout the state. Notably here in Southern California, 1879, the University of Southern California, which began as a Methodist school. And then 1891, Stanford University established. This was named after Leland Stanford's son, who had died an untimely death. And so he opened up a university in his son's name in 1891. So I just want to briefly mention some of the women that were mentioned in your textbook, and one that wasn't. So women in California become a really significant influence. California's uh, population of men and women do not even out until we get into 1900. So population of men outnumbers women all the way until 1900. But that begins to change, right, through this period as more and more women come to the state. Women do contribute quite a bit to the development of social institutions in California, humanitarian institutions, conservation movements, churches, political activists, educational institutions. Most of the elementary school teachers, for example, were women. And I already mentioned Laura DeForest Gordon. She was one of, along with Clara Fultz, one of the graduates of the Hastings Law School, and she will become a very a political activist in her own right, mainly fighting for the right of women to vote in California. So she becomes a real advocate for the suffragette movement, which was had a lot of support early on in the state. So much so that in 1879, when the Constitutional Convention was convened, that was one of the topics. The state rejected adopting universal female suffrage, but it was at least on the agenda, which shows how much it was on the minds of voters at the time. So a couple more examples of powerful California women, and there are so many I can't even name them all. But just while we're on the topic, Clara Shortridge Fultz, who you see pictured there on the left, she again earning a law degree from Hastings Law School, will go on to practice law in California, and she will actually be the inventor and um, create the role of the public defender. And this idea that if you cannot afford a lawyer, that you will get a lawyer assigned to you. And that becomes really critical for people, low income people, um, when for working their way through the justice system, particularly the criminal justice system. And then on the right hand side, you see a picture of Julia Morgan, also California woman, who will become a famous architect. And she was responsible for building some of the most iconic buildings here in the state of California. So you see here some examples of the buildings that she designed: Mills College Library, the YMCA in Oakland, California. The pool that you see pictured there is the famous pool at Hearst Castle. She was the primary architect for Hearst Castle. You also see Hearst Castle on the lower left-hand corner as well. So these are all images of buildings that are still around today that Julia Morgan designed. And again, she was a giant in her field at a time when women were not architects. Some really cool examples of California women. All right, so that'll do it for chapter 7. I will post chapter 8, and that will conclude the material for your exam. And have a good one.